Oh, welcome to Stillspeakpod. So I haven't done an update on the Gabby Petito case in a few days now because there's nothing really going on, right? Brian's allegedly deceased. I believe that to be true. We're waiting on them to finish up the investigation, to release us information, to get back a report from the medical examiner and anthropologist in relation to Brian and Laundrie. And so, there's just not a whole lot going on. What I did see is that most of the media is kind of gone now from the Laundrie home. Now, not all of them, but the majority of them. And I guess now it's really not necessary to be outside the house, and you can just report from wherever. Before, they were really at the house because they were waiting to see what was going to happen. Was the FBI going to show up? Was Brian going to come walking through the door? So on and so forth. And Brian Ensign, he actually left to go out to, I think I mentioned this to you guys the other day. I'm sure if you follow Brian Ensign, then you know all about it. He went out to Moab, Utah to basically retrace the steps of Brian and Gabby up into, Wyoming and Grand Teton National Park. And the whole idea was that he can interview people connected to the case, like Moonflower Co-op, where they had their domestic, Mary Piglet, where they allegedly had an issue, the Moab police officers, etc., etc. And now that, Brian was found deceased, I think they thought that by going out there that people would be more willing to talk now rather than when we didn't know where Brian was and, all the chaos was happening. Now, before I get to that, I want to talk about that for a second. Before I get to that, for the last 2 days, I have been working on something. I'm not going to call it a movie because I'm not like a movie maker or anything like that. But I put together from beginning to end of this case as we know it. Which will include, pictures to music, clips from different parts, and it's going to be, or it is, because I'm almost done with it, it's in order from, just before the August 12th incident to now, and what has happened with the protesters and Brian possibly being in the garden bed and the searches and Gabby being found, kind of like a timeline somewhat movie I'm doing. I think it'd be really interesting to kind of just watch it all as a whole, to see all that's happened over the last 6 weeks. I'm hoping that I will be uploading that shortly after this. However, it may be in the morning. We gotta see how far I get and how cooperative my house is. I don't want to do a half-assed job, I want to make it really worthy of something, at least somewhat YouTube worthy. Not big screen worthy, but YouTube worthy. So now I actually want to talk about a few things. And, well, let me start here. So Brian Ensign goes out there with the cameraman and they do this whole thing. They put out a special, I believe it was Thursday night. It was very well done. Beautiful. Bravo. Good job, Brian Ensign. So it was really well done. And there wasn't anything shocking that came out. Actually, wasn't shocking at all. It was just actually really kind of neat to see him on this journey after he's been following this case or reporting on this case as long as I have. And he's been doing it from the Laundrie home, which is an entirely different, viewpoint of this story. And I think the biggest takeaway from his trip has to do with the Mary Piglet restaurant. Now, just to refresh your memory here, somebody after the hitchhiker witnesses or the sources or the people who claim that they picked Brian up hitchhiking, which I still don't believe, by the way, and I have not changed my stance on that. After that, a woman had come out saying that she's seen the couple at the Mary Piglet restaurant in Jackson, Wyoming, and that there appeared to be some type of altercation between Brian and the hostess. and it involved Brian coming in and out of the restaurant a couple of times, screaming and yelling and cursing at this hostess. Gabby appeared to be very upset, and she was outside crying, and I guess they might have been fighting as well. And because I'm skeptical when it comes to people who come forth as sources or witnesses, because in my experience in other cases, sometimes witnesses and sources aren't very accurate, okay, or they exaggerate. So I'm always skeptical. Like, I hear so-and-so said, I'm like, all right, I get a little side eye to it. I'm like, I'll wait and see if this ends up being true. So when this story came out about this Mary Piglet, the claim was that it was on the 27th, about 1 p.m. in the afternoon. And as I'm doing my, processing of what this woman's saying, I'm like, all right, that's plausible, because the vloggers caught the van on the dirt road in Spread Creek that evening, about 5-6 o'clock, I believe it was. So they could have been at this restaurant at 1 o'clock in Jackson, Wyoming. And it's a restaurant, so it's not that far-fetched to think that they went there to eat. And who hasn't gone to a restaurant and had an issue at some point? I have a tendency to not, have a lot of tolerance. So I definitely have, that's for sure. I seem to always run into people who don't want to do their job, and I get a little angry, right? So I'm hearing this story and I'm thinking, like, okay, this does sound plausible. It's a restaurant, people gotta eat, and okay, so they had a little issue, right? And what happened was, of course, after this woman came out, and the people who didn't believe her, or the people who did believe her, wanted confirmation that this did happen. So they were blowing up this poor restaurant. They were messaging them on all their social media accounts, calling the restaurant, etc. And all the responses that I saw from the Mary Piglet basically said that they weren't aware of any such altercation, but that they would be checking into it. And shortly after that, they then posted to their Instagram account confirming that Brian and Gabby did visit the restaurant. But that was all they confirmed. And I said it in one of my videos, maybe even 2 of my videos. Actually, you know what? I probably said it 4 different times in 4 different videos. That all the restaurant did was confirm that they visited the restaurant. They didn't confirm what day. They didn't confirm what time. They didn't confirm if there was an altercation. They simply said that they did visit the restaurant and that they contacted the FBI. Okay? And when I said this in groups, oh my gosh, I was attacked left and right. Everybody was laughing at my comment when really what I said was a fact. What I said was exactly what the Instagram post said, right? So I was just making the point that, listen, they're not saying that this woman's being truthful or that what her account of what happened is accurate. They just said that they visited the restaurant, and that's not, far-reaching considering they were in the area. It's a restaurant, right? And I do remember saying that I was led to believe this person more than I was the hitchhiking stories, and I explained why back in that video. But again, being a skeptical person, I was not 100% sold on this. However, most people were. And so most everybody who believes this wholeheartedly based their theories off of this incident. They thought this was the incident that led to her death. Like, they argued at the restaurant, they continued arguing on the way to Spread Creek, and then something happened in Spread Creek which caused her death. That was the theories that people came up with. Which isn't a bad theory if you believed the restaurant incident. I can see that being a good theory, right? Because it looks like she died on the 27th, the 28th, or the 29th, possibly the morning of the 30th. To me, I think it's going to end up being it was the 27th, just based on the other information, like the weird stand text and whatnot, and the fact that the van was seen on that dirt road on the 27th, and then her body was about 1,000 feet away from there, very close. Well, when Brian Ensign went out there, he did go to the Mary Piglet, and the manager did not want to speak on camera. Now, some of you probably saw that. Some of you probably didn't. But she immediately said to him that what is being reported in the media is not what happened. Now, this is her claim. So, basically, it was said that the couple, Brian and Gabby, left without paying. The waitress followed them outside. They paid. And at some point, they went back inside, and Gabby was asking for their money back, and the restaurant said that they weren't giving them their money back. Now, I'm going to talk about what I think possibly happened here, but I have to say something first. So, of course, when the people who believed the restaurant thing heard the restaurant's version of events, they were bothered because it didn't fit their theories anymore. Because in their minds, Brian was the big bad guy who was screaming and yelling at the hostess, coming in and out of the store, causing a scene, and this is probably what ultimately resulted in Gabby's death later that day. So the groups exploded with people basically saying, I don't believe them, why are they changing the story, blah, 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 blah. I wasn't the least bit surprised by this at all. And I said it in my Summer Wells series. I probably said it in this series. But in almost every single case, sources and witnesses always seem to exaggerate, or their version of events is not accurate, or they flat out lie for attention. They want 5 minutes of fame. They want the clicks, the views, the blah, 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 blah. And that's my favorite, blah, 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 blah. And I can tell you right off the top of my head right here, in the Chris Watts case, there was a teenage boy involved in that situation, and he straight up lied to the investigators. And that's a fact, because the body cam footage showed something completely different than what he said happened. And what he said happened, he said after the fact, of course, because of the body cam, and I don't know if he realized there was body cam footage, but yeah, he definitely lied. Now, was it an intentional lie? I don't know. Was it an unintentional lie? I don't know. Could it have been an influenced lie? Like, it's in your mind that this person did this horrendous thing, and therefore you're going to say something that backs that up to make that person look more sketchy, more creepy than they actually were. Do you see what I'm saying? Where it's like an influenced lie. And in that particular instance, it wasn't that the version of events was just a little different. It was entirely different. And then you have to take into account this particular kid was 16 at the time, so you had to take that into consideration. And then you had other people in the Chris Watts case that, and I mentioned it before, the one guy who went on HLN with actually Ashley Banfield, who ended up getting fired from HLN in the middle of the Chris Watts case, that came on her show and was saying that, Chris Watts was gay, and he met him on this dating site. He was buying him lip injections, and it turned out that FBI looked into him, and he was completely full of it, like complete nonsense. So, that was somebody who wanted 5 minutes of fame. But, originally so many people wanted to believe it because it was outrageous and it was juicy and, oh my God, he was also having an affair with a gay man. And that's just one case. I can give you something that's happened in every case, but that's the ones just quickly off the top of my head that I can give you. So, the restaurant giving this different version of events and being like, nah, that's not what happened, didn't surprise me at all. And while most people were like not wanting to believe the restaurant, I'm like, well, this, I believe the restaurant, okay? Because I don't see a motive for them to lie. And somebody said, well, they might be trying to, save their business because this is bad press. And I'm like, that doesn't really make a whole lot of sense, though, because how is Brian freaking out on the restaurant at the hostess going to affect them in any way? I mean, that would say more about him than it does them, right? And also, people have turned this story into almost like a tourist attraction. People are going to the Carlson Reserve now, to where his body was found, like they're going to Disney World. They're going to, minus Brian Enton, who, he's a reporter, so of course, him doing that is one thing. But total, like, random strangers going to, like, Gabby's body site and Brian's, the location of his bones, and now people are wanting to go to Moab, Utah, or Grand Teton, etc. I would actually think that Mary Piglet being a part of this story would actually help them. Because if now, like 5 years from now, you're going on vacation, you're like, we're going to Jackson, Wyoming, you're going to be like, oh my god, that restaurant, Mary Piglet, I wonder if it's good, and you're going to go there. And then, of course, if you follow the case, you're really going to want to go there, because now you're going to want to see this Mary Piglet place, which is a really cute name, by the way, just out of curiosity, right? Oh, this is the place that Gabby and Brian right before she died. So other than that, I really don't see why, at this point, with the restaurant now also knowing that not only is Gabby deceased, but so is Brian, for them to really lie. I just don't. So what's key here is that this woman who came out with this restaurant story came out when, everything was at its height. And so there's going to be influence there, right? Because Brian's the big, bad, evil one. And so that's going to skew your version of events or your memory. And there was actually a study years ago. Don't ask me to pull it up right now because it was years ago, but I will gladly find it if you want it. But I remember reading that when your brain only remembers certain details, right? And then basically your imagination fills in the blanks. Is what it was trying to say. So now the two versions of what happened aren't entirely different. There's similarities of what happened, but this whole, like, Brian was the big bad guy screaming at the poor hostess doesn't seem to be part of this real version of events according to the restaurant. So let's compare the two. Restaurant lady said that she was sitting by them. She couldn't hear what was going on. She believed they were arguing over a bill. Okay? And he was yelling and cursing at this hostess, and he went in and out of the restaurant multiple times to yell at her, and Gabby was outside crying, and then they ultimately leave. Okay? So the restaurant's version is like, well, they didn't pay their bill, so, and then the waitress followed them outside, right? That was not included in the original, and that the waitress told them that, you didn't pay your bill, and then they paid for it on the street, and then at some point, they went in, the couple, Gabby and Brian, and Gabby is the one who asked for the money back. No mention of yelling, no mention of going in and out, okay? This other woman's story did not include the waitress going outside, not that I recall. So is it like two completely different stories? No. Are there minor differences? Yes. And what's important here is that restaurant lady would have just been a bystander in all this, right? She's watching this from her table, so she has to fill in the gaps because she can't hear and see what's going on outside. So her mind filled in the gaps of what was going on. For whatever reason, she recalls him coming in and out of the restaurant, but the restaurant's saying that's not the case. So I think this was a case of, if I had to say, I would say this was more of an influenced type of situation where this woman had it in her head already that Brian was, this awful person, and therefore this version of events was influenced by that. Not every source and witness has bad intentions. They don't. Sometimes it really is unintentional. And one of the things that didn't make me 100% believe this story, I thought it was more believable than the hitchhiking stories, but I wasn't completely sold on it, was because if she saw this, then clearly there's other people who saw this. Now, this is a restaurant that's in a tourist area. There had to be other people in the restaurant. And usually it takes one person coming forward to have another person come forward. So the fact that she came forward and this story was as huge as it was, and the fact that we didn't hear from another person who was in the restaurant that day to back her up, led me to be like, maybe it's not totally accurate. And typically somebody's not going to come forward and be like, well, I was there too, and that person's lying. That doesn't usually happen very often. The other thing that was said was that they did have surveillance footage, but they didn't think it was significant, and they told Brian Entin that it got deleted. Now, people assumed that they deleted it before speaking to the FBI. But after this woman's story came out, almost immediately is when Mary Piglet made the post that they had been at the restaurant, and they didn't confirm anything else, I have to throw that in there, and that they were in contact with the FBI. As a matter of fact, I'm going to read it to you word for word. Now, for context here, this post was on September 22nd, so this was 3 days after Gabby's body was found, and it was the day after hearing it was homicide. So that plays into all this too as far as influence is concerned. So their post said, yes, we can confirm Gabby and Brian were in Mary Piglet's. We have not deleted any comments or messages on social media. Now they said that because people were claiming that they were deleting things. The screenshots you see were direct messages to our account and were not public. We have already notified the FBI and they are aware. We are letting them do their jobs and we are respecting Gabby's family and have nothing further to comment. So it doesn't clarify in there that they gave footage to the FBI, but I have to wonder if they contacted the FBI, gave them the footage, and then after that is when they felt like, well, this isn't really significant at this point. We gave it to the FBI. We don't need any more of like the hard copy, right? And they deleted it. And so then when our reporter showed up, they're like, well, we didn't think it was significant enough to save, so we deleted it. But see, most people assumed that it meant that they didn't even give the FBI the footage. I'm not so sure that's the case. They could have, and just after the fact was like, well, we don't really need this, so we'll just delete it. And even if no footage, there's going to be some type of transaction that is down in their, I don't know how they do their books at the Mary Piglets, but, somewhere in there they're going to have some type of receipt of sorts, even if they paid with cash. Now, we're talking a lot about this situation, but this was like a big piece of Brian Entin's piece. Let's talk about what the restaurant claims happened and what I think possibly could have happened here. So it was that they didn't pay, they got followed outside, they end up paying for it on the street, and then they go in together, and it's Gabby who asked for the money back, and they said no. So there's a possibility here that maybe the service was bad, maybe the food was terrible, maybe they waited for maybe they ordered drinks and appetizers and their food, but their food was taking so long, so they ended up just leaving and they didn't want to pay for their drinks and appetizer. So they walk out, let's just say, either or, that they didn't like the food or they didn't like the service or they were waiting too long for their food. And they go outside, and they were just going to leave, but they end up getting stopped by the waitress, so now you're like, oh, shit. So you pay for it. You're like, all right, fine, whatever, I'll pay you for it. And then, I don't know who, but maybe one or the other was bothered by the fact that they had to pay this woman, and either Brian made Gabby go ask for the money back because he was mad, or maybe Brian paid and Gabby was mad that he did that, right? And she went back to get the money. Now, I can give you my house, and let me tell you, in my house, there's no, I'm not like the dominant one at all. And I'm also not the submissive one by any means. And so when we're in a restaurant, right, my husband's the type of person that, now I was a waitress for many, many, many years. And so I'm the person who like stacks the dishes for the waitress. I clean the whole table. I clean the floor, for God's sake. And so it's just out of habit, and I want to help them out because I know what it's like, right? But I also know what it's like, and so I know that when you don't like your meal, for example, most waitresses don't care that you don't like your food, and they'll just be like, okay, we'll get you a new plate, or maybe it was too cold, or maybe you don't like the way it tastes. I don't care. I'm just doing my job. Okay, sure, I'll get you a new plate of food. No big deal. So if I'm missing something or I don't like my plate, I'm the first person to be like, hey, I don't like this, And my husband, if he doesn't, he just sucks it up and eats it. That's it. Because he's like, I don't want to be that guy. I don't want to be like annoying to the waitress and bother her and make her have to go and tell the kitchen to make me all this new food. Like, he can't be bothered with it. So we're two totally different people, and I'm always like, just tell them. He's like, no. And he sits there and eats the crappy food. I'm like, why? Just say something. So now I can only go off of our relationship, right? So in that scenario, let's say we didn't like our food, the service was bad, or we were waiting for our food too long and we just gave up and wanted to walk out and we got stopped. My husband would be the one to be like, I'm just going to pay them. And let's just pay them. I don't want to deal with this. I don't want an argument. I don't want to get arrested. We're just going to pay them. Just here. Fine. Here. Take the money. Where I'd be like, why would you do that? Why would you give them the money? Blah, blah, blah. And yeah, I'd probably storm back in the restaurant and be like, hey, your food sucked. Give me my money back. And my husband would be standing outside like, oh, God. Like that. Like, can we not do this, please? I'm not saying that's what happened with them. I'm just putting myself in that scenario, and I could just envision this whole thing between me and my husband, and me being like, no, I'm going back in. Him being like, no, you're not. Let's just go. Who cares? It's only $30. No big deal. So that could have been the case. She comes out. Brian's like, I'm just going to pay her. And Gabby's like, why the hell are you paying her? And then she goes back in and gets the money. Or she paid. And then he was like, no, go back in there and get our money back. Who knows, right? But this is what apparently, according to the restaurant, happened. So now I can't wait to see if anything comes out as far as the hitchhiking claims. Now the problem with the hitchhiking claims, because you know that I think it's a bunch of BS, is that I don't really know how the FBI can prove that this actually happened. You'd have to just take these people's words for it, because how are you going to, there's no like cameras in the Grand Teton area of where this happened, where they can like see him getting in the van or the car, whatever it was that picked him up. So how are you going to prove that? And there was no like transaction. The only way that they'll be somewhat able to prove that is off of, oh, you know what? This actually might work. The cell phone record. So if he had his cell phone on him when he allegedly, hiked 20-something miles and then hitchhiked, they'll have maybe, possibly, depending, the pings. If they even had service out there, right? So maybe, possibly, the phone records will show that. So I'm really curious if those stories are going to turn out to be true, based upon this whole restaurant ordeal that came out. But anyway, moving on. So then Brian Enton went to Grand Teton, Sprite Creek area. He went straight to the spot that the van had been parked during the vlogger's video of the van on the dirt road. And then we watch as he walks almost directly out from where that van was. And he walked through 3 creeks. Two of them seemed to be like minor little creeks. But another one, and I know why he did this, because he wanted to show the elements. He walked through this creek with his boots and jeans on, which he must have been freezing. And it was a large creek, and it was a little bit deeper. It was like up to his, maybe ankles or a little bit higher than that. And he said it was about 1,000 feet out from where the van was. And I guess when he heard 1,000 feet, he wasn't thinking it was that far. But then once you walk it and you have to walk through these 3 creeks, it's a bit of a ways out there. And I remember her stepdad saying on Dr. Phil that it looked like possibly they had been camping at that spot because there was a fire ring and where you would possibly put a tent, and it was right in front of the mountains. Absolutely beautiful area, and it's so tragic what happened at that spot, but gosh, was it beautiful. So seeing that, obviously on camera, I would like to see it in person just to get the idea of it, but I'm not going to be one of those people that I'm going to go to Grand Teton now and go visit Gabby's, where her body was. That's not my thing. It's something really tragic and horrible happened there, and I almost feel like that's kind of a sacred area. But again, that's not bashing any type of reporter going there. That I totally understand, so they can give everybody else a glimpse of what it's like. But anyways, just based upon seeing it on camera, it really got me thinking about her dying. And I'm like, okay, so what the freak happened here? Because, Mary Piglet still didn't confirm that they were there on the 27th. I didn't hear anything about them confirming it was the 27th at 1 o'clock. However, it does line up with what the woman thought she saw, as far as there was something with the staff, which is accurate. And so it had to be the 27th. And then the vlogger's video, I believe, was at 6. So that was about 5 hours later. So they had to leave the restaurant. They had to get back to Grand Teton, to the Sprite Creek area. They had to park the van. And this is what's kind of throwing me off, is if you're camping over there, then you're going to need to, because it is 1,000 feet and you have to walk through 3 different creeks to get there, you're having to carry your camping stuff through 3 creeks. Okay? Now, a tent's not that big, but it also depends what you're carrying out there. So I'm thinking to myself, did they camp out there? But then how did they get out there? How did she die out there? Well, maybe she didn't die out there. Maybe he dragged her out there. So I've been processing this. I'm not sure if they got back to Sprite Creek that afternoon and set up camp. I have to wonder, because on the 26th, there are only several witnesses who claim to have seen them, and every witness's story doesn't make any sense. One saw them in Idaho together. One saw him in Yellowstone alone and aggravated. Another one saw him alone in Grand Teton acting strange. Another one saw the couple together, I believe it was in Montana. So we don't really have a whole lot of information about the 26th. Now the 25th was the Ogden picture, which is the butterfly mural picture. So I was thinking to myself, and I was like, I wonder if they camped at that spot on the 26th and set up camp at that location, and then possibly, the next day they left to go to the lunch, and then they ended up back at that location, and maybe we're going to set up camp again out there, because we don't really know where they were on the 26th. So were they in Spray Creek on the 26th? Because they can't be in Idaho, Montana, and Yellowstone and Grand Teton all in the same day. So that's not possible. I don't know. I'm just processing out loud here. I don't know. It's just a really odd location to park your van and then walk through those creeks with your camping gear and, all that jazz. Now, some people think he lured her out there to kill her. I don't believe that. I don't believe he was like, oh, hey, Gabby, let's go for a walk so I can kill you. No, I don't think it happened like that. Whatever reason they were over in that particular area, an argument ensued, and in the heat of the moment, heat of passion, she was attacked, probably out there. If she was killed out there. Now, there's also this possibility here that she was dragged there. So, here's a possibility. Let's say they camped out there on the 26th. They leave the next day, they go to the Merry Piglet, they come back, they park in that same spot to go camp out there again. Some type of argument ensues at the van, and it happens there. He puts her in the van, in the back of the van, there's more than enough room, and he waits for nightfall, and then he drags her out there. Now, could he have dragged her out there 1,000 feet? Well, not necessarily, because you're talking about dead weight, which if you have children, when they're sleeping, they weigh a heck of a lot more, or it seems, than, when they're not sleeping. Could he have carried her out there? Well, how strong was Brian? Probably not. That being said, that doesn't mean that he didn't use something to drag her out there. And even if you're doing it at night, it wouldn't be as suspicious if you saw somebody dragging something through that area, which it was a very remote area, so I doubt there was anybody else really out there at night. But it wouldn't look as weird. You would think that they were carrying some form of equipment to go camping with, or at least I would look and be like, oh, maybe that's just like their tent or their bag that they're using. I wouldn't probably consider that it was a body. And I hate talking about it, but there's also this possibility there, they were on this trip for a long period of time. They could have had luggage or one of those big tote bags that he possibly put her in and to transport her. There's so many different possibilities here. I don't think it necessarily means that she died out there just because that's where she was. Now, the idea that there was this possible tent set up because the stepdad saw what appeared to be where a tent had been set up in a ring of fire doesn't necessarily mean that they were at the campsite and had an argument. It could have been that they camped the day prior, like I just said, and then we're going to go back to that area and something happened. I don't know. So I'm going to process that more because I think that gave us a really good view of the elements. And those creeks just really kind of threw me off. I was like, okay, that's really weird. That you would go, tra-la-laing with all your camping equipment out there. But, hey, I'm not much of a wilderness type of person, so maybe that's why I think that. The next thing was the Moab thing. I want to talk about Moab. So the Moab, I guess, assistant chief was interviewed by Brian. He took them, Brian and the cameraman, to the spot where the domestic altercation happened. Of course, there's an active investigation going on right now for Moab police due to that incident from an independent agency. So they can't really talk about what happened. But I thought it was really sweet that this man not apologized, but sent their condolences to Gabby's family. I felt it was very heartfelt and sweet. And I felt there was a lot of compassion. And I also felt that he expressed a good deal of guilt that is being felt by the officers involved. So while I wouldn't normally be like, oh, I'm glad that you feel guilty, in a sense, I kind of do, because that shows me that they care that what happened, and that they are now going to be looking to see how they can change it for the future. Now, of course, that doesn't help Gabby, right? But it always takes the one story that's going to make a change. So for that, I'm kind of glad that there is a feeling of compassion and possibly regret and guilt, because that will lead to some form of change. Even if they did nothing wrong, it's taking that situation and going, okay, clearly what was said was going on was not what was going on, because she's the one that ends up dead, right? So what can we learn from this? We didn't do anything wrong, but maybe there was something that we've never dealt with before that we could possibly change and do better from it. And it was mentioned that one of the officers actually did want to speak with Brian Ensign, but he couldn't because of the active investigation. And if I had to guess between which officer at the scene it was that wanted to speak with Brian Ensign, I'm going to go with it was the main officer, not the bearded officer. And if you saw my 4-part series on the body cam footage, you would know that I kept referring to the officer who came on the scene after the fact, not after the fact, but he came on the scene a little bit into it, and he left a little bit before it ended, and I call him the bearded officer because he's the only one with like a beard. He is the one who was like showing Brian that he was like kind of his buddy, because he's like getting him out of the sun, and Brian was worried about his head being exposed to the sun while sitting on the curb. And the main officer is the one who pulled him over. So I think if I had to guess between the two, I'm going to go with the main officer, because in the end, he's the one who said on camera, he said, well, basically, he didn't say these exact words. I forget his exact words, but we talk about it in the body cam series I did, where it was basically, I'm screwed if I do, and I'm screwed if I don't. So he knew that he was in a situation that day that either way, he was going to probably be in a situation. He probably just didn't realize the extent of that situation, of what happens 15 to 18 days later. So those are the things that stood out to me from Brian Ensign's special. And the other thing is that he was talking about how a lot of people in Moab did not want to speak to any type of reporters because they had the two big stories back to back. They had Kylan and Crystal, the newlyweds who were killed in Moab, the same time frame that Brian and Gabby were pulled over there. So, and Gabby's story was enormous, but Kylan and Crystal's story was, relatively big too, at least in the true crime community it was. So they have a lot of focus on them. That town has a lot of focus on them right now. And so they seem to really not want to get any more public attention because it is a tourist area, and I guess they're concerned that it's going to hurt their industry, basically. In a way, I can understand what they're trying to say, but at the same time, again, especially people who follow true crime stories, it actually sparks them to want to go even more. There's an intrigue, because then you can go there and you can be like, oh, this is where, Crystal and Kylan were killed. Oh, and this is where Gabby and Brian stopped. And oh, this is the coffee shop Gabby and Brian went to. I mean, people do that. They just do that. But on the other hand, their second point was that, the person who killed Crystal and Kylan still hasn't been caught. They don't know if that person's a local. They were scared. So that part I totally understand. As far as hurting their industry, I'm not so sure. I think it will actually help them. But whatever. Then again, I can't imagine living in this area and being a local, and these two big stories happen back to back. Up until Gabby's case, I never even heard of Moab, Utah. True story. And I never heard of Grand Teton National Park. So, yeah. And I'm in my late 30s. As a matter of fact, I think it was my first episode, somebody who was listening corrected the way I said Teton, because I said Teton. So thank you to that listener for helping me with that. I greatly appreciated it. When she explained how it was said, I was like, oh, I was so grateful that she did that. Because sometimes, man, you see so many different location names and city names and people's names and last names. And it's hard because sometimes Google will say it's one thing and it's not. And then you're like, oh, I don't want to butcher this person's last name, especially if they're missing or deceased, because then you feel bad, right? So I'm very grateful for that person who helped me out with that, because I had never even heard of that park. As a matter of fact, I didn't hear about most of any of the national parks that they went to when I was doing my first timeline video ever, except for, of course, Colorado Springs. And I was very well aware of the Great Sand Dunes, or the Grand Sand Dunes in Colorado, because of the Chris Watts case, because him and his mistress actually visited the sand dunes as well 3 years prior. So, anyway, that's that. So, other than that, nothing else is really going on, and we're waiting. We're in wait mode right now to see what information is going to come out, how this is all going to be ultimately resolved and come to a conclusion. And since it is, Florida, and there's certain laws here that, we do get a significant amount of information from law enforcement, I don't know how long that's going to take. So we're in wait time, and we'll see what happens. So that's it, and I'll talk to you soon. Until next time.